Hi everyone, Crista Cowan here with another episode of The Barefoot Genealogist. Today we are doing the fourth in a series of presentations about the Genealogical Proof Standard. We did an introduction, we covered the first two steps of the Genealogical Proof Standard, and today we'll be talking about the third step, which is analysis and correlation of collected information. I'll cover why that's important throughout the presentation. And then we'll just talk about some specific steps that I use to both analyze and correlate the information I'm collecting about my ancestors. Now, there are a couple of things I just need to let you know about. We've only got 20 or 25 minutes together here today, and this is a topic that very often is presented at length in genealogical conference classes and courses at institutes. And so just be aware that I'm only going to skim the surface of this topic. At the end of the presentation, I'll give you a couple of additional resources that you can use, but one of the biggest things that I can suggest for you to become more familiar with this topic is to just attend a genealogical conference when it comes to an area near you and take a class from one of the master genealogists. Very often, even if the specific topic is not about the Genealogical Proof Standard, you can see how they weave it through the case studies that they present. So with that introduction, let's go ahead and dive in so that we've got all the time available that we need here. For those of you who may not have caught the first couple of episodes in this series, let me just let you know where this information comes from. The Board for Certification of Genealogists has a manual called Genealogy Standards. The 50th anniversary edition of that manual just came out earlier this year. You can purchase it online. They then outline the 5 steps of the Genealogical Proof Standard, which are a reasonably exhaustive search, complete and accurate citation of sources, analysis and correlation of the collected information, resolution of conflicting evidence, and a soundly reasoned and coherently written conclusion. So this is the process that we go through in order to put information into our family trees that is accurate, in order to write up information about our family history. And so we're going to talk today about this third step. Now, there's an interesting thing about this third step. I think there is a reason why it comes smack dab in the middle. And that is because, for me at least, in my process of researching my family history and coming to conclusions about what is and is not accurate information, this step very often is woven through several of the others. I do what I believe is a reasonably exhaustive search. I cite my sources, and then as I get down to this analysis and correlation step, I realize there are more records I can find, and so I go back to this reasonably exhaustive search, and it just kind of is woven through it, and you'll probably see that as we talk about the things we're going to talk about today. Let's just look at the definition that is directly from the BCG website. They state that analysis and correlation of information includes these 2 points. One is that it facilitates sound interpretation of the data contributed by each source. So a source is, of course, the records that you are using, or the people that you are talking to in your family, or the tree that you just looked at, right? All of those are sources. And we have to be able to analyze that source and interpret it correctly, meaning we need to know, we need to know how accurate the information is. We need to be able to make sure we're getting all of the information on that particular record. I also love that they use the phrase each source. That clearly says that we need to be looking at multiple records, not just grabbing one census record or one birth certificate or one record and saying this is all the information I need about my person before I can move on to the next generation. Each source, again, it kind of weaves back to that concept of a reasonably exhaustive search. Are we collecting all of the records? The next point that they make on the BCG website about this particular step in the GPS is that it ensures that the conclusion reflects all the evidence. Okay, again, a lot of times we enter information into our family history software or, write it down as part of our family history, and we need to make sure that whatever conclusions we're drawing about what this person's name was, or what those relationships are in that family, or when a particular event in their life occurred, we need to make sure that conclusion reflects all the evidence, not just that we cherry-picked the pieces of evidence that fit our preconceived notions, or that, we think, somehow magically makes sense, right? There needs to be a reason why it makes sense. There needs to have been a correlation of the evidence and a resolution of conflicting evidence, which is the next step, in order to come to that conclusion. So that's kind of the overview of this particular step. Let me just walk you through some of the processes that I use, the methodology that I use as I go through this step. Mostly it's just questions that I ask myself. Sometimes this involves writing. A lot of times it involves additional research, but here's where I start. Why was this information recorded at this time in this way? Whenever you are looking at a particular record or source, ask yourself that question. That becomes a really important part of this analysis step. One of the things that I think we sometimes forget is that none of the records we use were created, most of the records that we use were not created for genealogical purposes. I'll use the census really heavily as an example in our time together today. The census was not created for genealogical purposes, and yet it is one of the foundational records of genealogical research. And so why was the census created? Well, it was created because it's constitutionally required here in the United States that we enumerate everybody in the country every 10 years. And the questions that are included on each census are determined by the government, and they're different every time. There are some similarities or some standard pieces of information that are recorded, but a lot of that changes from census to census. So the question is, why was this information recorded at this time in this way? That helps you to analyze the record in such a way that you can start to understand what may be accurate, what may not be accurate, what might have been a copy of information, what information might be intentionally or unintentionally true or false, and we'll talk about that here in just a minute. The next question then that I ask myself as I analyze a particular source is, who provided the information? The informant on any piece of information is a really important part of your analysis because it helps you understand how accurate or inaccurate this information may or may not be. Now, I'll use the census as an example, and then we'll talk about another example that's a little bit more effective. The challenge with the census, as an example, is that until 1940, we have no idea who the informant was to the census taker. Okay. In 1940, of course, there is a little circle with an X next to the name of the person in the household who provided the census taker with the information. Prior to that, there is no notation at all. And so the census taker could have been given that information by the head of the household, by the mother of the family, by the 13-year-old daughter, or by the next door neighbor. We don't know. A census taker was only required to visit a home 3 times, and if nobody was home or available to give him the information, he could get that information from whomever could provide it, a neighbor, the postmaster, whatever, okay? And so thinking about who provided the information on a census, that gives you pause when you don't know to say, you know what, this is good information, but in my analysis of it, I need to realize that a lot of this information may be inaccurate, and it may be inaccurate because the person giving the information had no clue, okay? And so keep that in mind when you're looking at census records. Another source that we use in family history where an informant is known is a death certificate. Very often on a death certificate, it will list right on the certificate who the informant is. And so one of the questions we have to answer in this analysis step is, what is the relationship of that person, of that informant, to the person in question and the event in question? So if I'm looking at a death certificate, and this death certificate is for a child, and the informant is the father of that child, that information on that death certificate is going to carry a different weight in my mind and in my analysis process than a death certificate of an old man whose son-in-law is the informant. Okay? And here's why. Information on records, records themselves are either original or derivative, right? Meaning we're either looking at an original record or we're looking at some kind of a derivative record that has been copied and copied and copied, or index. We're looking at an index only or whatever, okay? So sources are either original or derivative. Information on sources can be either primary or secondary. And very often, as in the case of a death certificate, the information on that document can be both primary and secondary. So on a death certificate, for example, the death information, the death date and place, that is primary information. It was information recorded at the time the event occurred by someone who knew the information. The birth information or the parents' names or other information that's on a death certificate is usually secondary, meaning the person providing the information has no firsthand knowledge of that event, okay? So here's why you see why the informant might be important. If the informant is the father of a young child, that birth information now becomes primary information. He was present at the birth of the child. He knows the child's birth date and place. If the informant is a son-in-law, well, he doesn't have firsthand knowledge of the birth date and place of his father-in-law. He just knows what he's been told, okay? He probably also doesn't have firsthand knowledge of who his father-in-law's parents were. He just knows what he's been told. And so that's all part of this analysis process is figure out who the informant was if you can. Why was the information recorded, right? What information on that particular source is primary or secondary? And just because it is primary or secondary doesn't mean it's accurate, okay? That's the next step in this process of analysis. Is there any reason, this is the question, is there any reason this information could have been misreported intentionally or unintentionally? Okay? Unintentional misreporting of information means somebody just screwed up. They said the wrong date or the wrong name or the wrong place and it got recorded. Intentional misreporting, right, that also happens. So what is a reason information could be intentionally misreported? Well, if a young man was too young to sign up for the draft but really wanted to serve, he may lie about his age. That's an intentional misreporting of information on a document. So think about, if a couple wanted to get married and the state law at the time required that they have parental permission due to their age, they may have lied about their age in order to get married without parental permission. Lots of reasons why information gets intentionally or unintentionally reported or misreported. And so in your analysis process, you need to ask yourself that question as you look at the information. Is there any reason this information could have been misreported? And that goes not just for birth dates and ages, but places and names and relationships as well. Okay, so we're not just looking at a specific piece of information, but we're looking at all information. The next question that I ask myself in this analysis process is this an original record or is it information that has been copied? So that comes back to that concept of an original source or a derivative source. And sometimes that gets a little tricky to know. Sometimes it's really easy, right? If you're looking at an index of a birth record, that is not an original record. You are looking at what somebody else has copied off of that record into an index format. And so that you need to take that into consideration in your analysis, because every time information is copied, it introduces opportunities for errors to be made. Errors in spelling, errors in date transposition, errors in coding. I've seen a lot of times where when indexes are created for birth, marriage, or death records, rather than write out the full county every time, whoever it was that created the index, whatever agency or organization, was instructed just to code the name of the county. And so they'd put in the county code, and then later that gets translated as this information becomes digital or gets published into a book. That code gets translated into the name of the county. They do that as a time-saving factor in indexing a lot of times, and yet sometimes what that means is the wrong code got written down, or the wrong code, or the code got translated into the wrong county name. So anytime information is copied, you're introducing opportunity for error. So of course the idea as genealogists is for us to always get as close to that original record as possible. If you're looking at an index, that's great. And analyze that, correlate it with the other information you have, include that, but where does that index lead you? Get yourself back to that original record. If you need to write the county or send away to the state or whatever, always get as close to that original record as you can. Another question that I ask as I go through this analysis process is information on the record explicitly stated, or is it just implied? Sometimes we get so familiar with these records, or we have ideas, again, this preconceived notion concept. We have ideas in our head of what somebody's name should be or what their birth date should be, that we look at this information and we sometimes draw conclusions when the information is not explicitly stated on the record. And a simple example of this, again, is the census. Very often what we are looking for when we look at census records is we are looking for names, birth dates and places, and relationships, as well as the primary piece of information on a census record, which is residence at the time of census. And so as we look at this record and analyze this particular record, one of the things that I sometimes skim over in my mind, I think, is I do the math, right? Because the census does not explicitly state the birth year of the person, with one exception, the 1900 census. All other censuses, the only thing they state is the age of the person at the time of the census, okay? Which means that the birth year is implied. And that means that I'm doing math, either in my head or on paper, trying to figure out how old this person is. So again, in my process of analysis, if the information is explicitly stated, that's good. If it's implied, I need to make sure that all the processes of getting to the explicit information are correct. Did I do my math right? Did the census taker do their math right? And all of that has to kind of work out. So just keep that in mind as you analyze these particular records. And then, as I mentioned earlier, very often this particular step in the GPS is kind of all-encompassing. It's not a linear process, right? I don't collect all records and then cite all sources and then analyze and correlate all information and then resolve conflicting evidence and then come to a conclusion. It doesn't work linearly like that, as much as we sometimes like things to be that neat and orderly. Very often I get to this step and I realize there are additional records I need to locate. Maybe it's that original record that I need to go track down. Again, I'll use the census as an example. Census records from 1900 through 1930 state year of immigration and naturalization status. So again, what I'm looking at is, as I start to analyze this census record, it points to additional records that I might need to go obtain. If a person has become naturalized, I need to look through the federal naturalization records available on Ancestry, or go to the local county where the person was living to see if they were naturalized at a county courthouse and obtain that documentation. I need to go through passenger lists and obtain that immigration information. Maybe I'm looking at a family on a census and I see a gap between the ages of the children that is unusual, particularly in the days prior to birth control. We end up with, if there's a gap in the ages of children, that is a clue about a couple of things possibly. It could be that there was a child born who died before the census was taken. And so now I have additional records I need to go locate about this family. Maybe it's a clue that the older children in this family are not the children of the wife listed on that census. Maybe she's a second wife and the younger children are hers, but the older children belong to a first wife, and that's why the gap. So again, this analysis of information, and I keep using censuses because they're something we're all familiar with, but this works with all kinds of records. That analysis very often will point to additional records that I then need to go and locate. Now let's talk about correlation. We've only got a few minutes left, and this is a little bit more complicated of a process for newbies to wrap their heads around, but I want to give you this introduction and get your brain starting to work on it, and then like I said, I'll give you some resources where you can go to learn more. First of all, correlation, by its very definition, requires multiple sources. You cannot correlate a record with itself, okay? So what you're doing is you are correlating multiple sources of information. Now, it's really important to remember that there is no set number. A lot of times I'll hear people say, oh, well, I need 3 sources for every piece of information that I enter into my family tree. And that is absolutely not true. There is no set number. You need as many pieces of information as you can correlate before you come to a conclusion. And we'll talk here in just a second about one of the reasons why that's true, but keep that in mind, okay? First of all, it requires multiple sources. So that reasonably exhaustive search to gather all the records you can about an individual or a family is a really necessary step. Here is the reason why, one of the reasons why it requires multiple sources, okay? The question you have to ask yourself is, are these sources independent? Meaning, is the information that you're looking at, did it all come from the same place? Or did it come from independent sources? And just because you have multiple sources doesn't mean the information is independent. Let me give you an example. Let's say that a woman writes her marriage date into her family Bible when she gets it on the occasion of her 10th anniversary. So on her 10th anniversary, she gets a family Bible as a gift, and she writes her marriage date, and then she writes hers and her husband's birth dates, and she writes down the birth dates of each of her children. And then as time passes, she continues to add information about the family to that particular family Bible. That's very often how family Bibles are started. Okay? The first several entries very often are written years after the event actually occurred. So this woman writes her marriage date into a family Bible. Now, years later, her husband passes away, and she applies for a pension. And when she applies for that pension, she gets out that family Bible, and she may even tear out the pages of that family Bible because there were not copy machines at the time, and she includes that in her application for her widow's pension. So that's the proof that she gives of her marriage to her husband. Again, flash forward years later, this woman dies, and her children decide to have a tombstone erected for her and her husband, and engraven on the tombstone, they use that information that their mother provided, and they engrave a marriage date onto the tombstone. So now you're looking at 3 sources: a tombstone, a pension file, and a family Bible. And the thing is, none of those sources are independent. All of that information came from really the same source. Okay, it came from that woman and the information that she originally wrote in that family Bible. Okay, so just because you have 3 records that say something or 3 sources that say something does not mean that information is independent. So you have to go back and look for something independent. An independent record in this case would be a marriage record that was recorded in the church at the time they were married, or that was filed with the county, or a license that they obtained and then filed with the county at the time that they were married. An independent source might be a family letter or document where somebody attended the wedding and wrote a notation about it or corresponded with somebody about it at the time. So you have to sometimes get a little creative, okay? And that's just one example. Certainly these kinds of examples abound, okay? So you need multiple sources, and just because you have multiple sources Doesn't mean the information is independent, so you also need to look for independent information. Now, one of the other things that I do, and if you've spent any time with me, you're aware of this, is that I transcribe every record I find. I do it directly into the notes in my Family Tree Maker program. There's also a notes feature in the Ancestry online trees. So I transcribe every record I find, every census record, every draft card, every tombstone, every tax record, every city directory, every record I find, I transcribe it, meaning I take whatever is on this record and I type it into my notes. Okay, I do that for a couple of reasons, and I've got a couple of videos out there specifically about notes. One for online trees and one just for the process of note taking in general, and then one specifically for FTM. But I do this process for a couple of reasons. It's part of my analysis, make sure I'm paying attention to all the details on a record. It also puts all of my information that I am collecting into one location so that I can quickly correlate it, so that I can look very quickly at what I've written about 3 successive censuses and a draft card and what I found on a birth record and a death record, all on one page, on this note page that I've created, and quickly look for consistencies or inconsistencies. That's part of correlation, is you are looking for consistencies and inconsistencies in that information. And so one of the things that I find very useful is to keep a notebook handy. This can be a digital notebook or an actual pen and paper notebook, but keep a notebook handy while you're researching, because you're going to notice patterns and conflicts, you're going to have questions, and sometimes you get in that groove of researching, that groove of collecting information and doing your reasonably exhaustive search, and you don't want to stop in the middle to go through this process of analysis and correlation, or you kind of want to weave it through. And so having a notebook handy just to quickly note patterns, conflicts in records, questions you have, further records you need to research, sometimes that's an easy way to help keep you focused, but it's also a way to start to correlate some of this information. And this is a really big task written into a really small bullet point, but the idea is start to play around with the data that you found. One of the steps of correlation, one of the ideas around correlation of information is to start looking at that information in different ways, to see what's missing, to see what holes you have, to see what information conflicts with each other. And so very often I will create timelines, and you can do that as well. As a matter of fact, I think Juliana has done a video on how to create timelines and how she uses them in her research. But create timelines, and not just a timeline of specific events in this person's life, but leaf into that the birth dates of their children and when and where they moved and when they purchased land and when they showed up in a tax record, and like all of that, create this timeline of their life. It's going to help you start to see patterns and conflicts, and it's going to cause you to have some questions that you can then do further research to answer. Timelines are great because they're just kind of text-based. You can do it in any kind of a document file. Tables, which you can do in any kind of a spreadsheet file, are another way to correlate information. I very often, especially when I'm doing pre-1850 census work, will use a spreadsheet and create tables about each census year and how old the people should be, and then I go through the tick marks on the census and try to, again, correlate that information that I'm collecting with the information I know about the family to come to some conclusions. You can also plot land, do land plat maps. You can map out migration patterns. All of those are going to help you see things in a different way. As a matter of fact, Michelle Simmons Lewis, who's a genealogy blogger, she said the more ways you arrange and rearrange your data, the more things you will see. And I absolutely believe that that's true. My experience is the more I play with it, the more I write it out or put it in a spreadsheet or do a timeline or look at a map or draw things on that map, the more I play with my data, arrange and rearrange it, the more things I see. The more patterns I notice, the more conflicts I notice, the more questions I have, the more research I do, the more answers I get. So it's a really beautiful thing. Okay, finally, let me just share with you the 2 additional resources, because like I said, 20 or 30 minutes is not anywhere near enough time to cover this topic. Thomas Jones, Dr. Jones, has done a video webinar called Using Correlation to reveal facts that no record states. It's about 45 minutes long, and you can find it by just Googling that title there, Using Correlation to Reveal Facts That No Record States, by Thomas W. Jones. You can find that video online, and it is available for free. He is not only a master genealogist, but he's also a master teacher, and he uses several actually case studies in that quick 45 minutes to show how he correlates information in almost all the ways we've talked about. He uses, he writes information out or transcribes information. He does timelines, he does mapping, he does tables, all of it, and he shows you some really specific examples so that you can start to wrap your head around how that might look as you tackle your own research. And then Michael Hyatt, who is another genealogy blogger, well, he's a genealogist and a blogger. He has a blog post called Correlating Information from Multiple Records. Again, if you just Google that, Correlating Information from Multiple Records by Michael Hyatt, you'll find his blog post. It's not very long, but he gives an example of correlating information across several censuses for a family, and it's a really fascinating case study because the family has very different names in each of the census records, but because he correlates the information in the way he does, he's able to determine that it is in fact the same family, despite the fact that their names change drastically. So those are the two sources of additional information I would encourage you to go check out if you want to know more about this topic. Next month, we will be covering the next step in the Genealogical Proof Standard. I hope you'll join us, and if you haven't watched previous episodes of this particular series, you can find them on our YouTube channel. The URL is there at the bottom of your screen. Until next time, this is Crista Cowan. Have fun climbing your family tree.